Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, real quick. That Archie
No,
get ready.
now this wait, chill. Now this definition of God that I'm using is going to be a necessary immaterial mind that creates the universe, progenies the universe, whatever the fuck. First premise is going to be that space is not fundamental, at least in explanation of itself. I'm going to justify this using the fact that space doesn't account for information. This information has never been shown to be affected by space in between particles, and that means that the universe is emergent, at least in the classical sense, principalities or metaphysics. And then the second premise is our minds can only be modeled in terms within non-physical reality, so all other states are collapsible, it can't be reduced using purely physical models. The third premise is going to be the same non-physical processes give rise and supersede space-time and matter according to the priors, clearly denoting that all is impossible for the universe to be self-sufficient in a physical sense. And the first conclusion is going to be, hence it's necessary that the progenitor, physicality as a model of non-physicality, which will be indistinguishable from or identical to a mind. Then the fourth premise is that minds are the only non-spatial agent that we are aware of that can generate information. We know non-existence itself is also not spatial, but it isn't an agent, neither does it generate information. Then the fifth premise is going to be the seemingly necessary mind behind the coronation of the universe is what we would call God. Then the second conclusion would be therefore God exists. And then the third conclusion would be therefore there's no possible world in which God does not exist given its necessary existence and the logicality of the contrary position. Infinity, get up here. Hold up.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we accept the first premise.
That's cool. Yo, Infinity, get up here. All right. Cool.
Yo, what we doing, man?
Infinity,
God's
did you catch up?
existence.
They're doing God's existence, Infinity.
You said what?
We're doing God's
we're
existence.
doing God's existence.
Currently, he's defending the view that it's impossible for
that
the world to
God
exist
exists.
without God.
And what is God?
It says it's impossible for God not to exist.
I know classical. That's why I asked him. I don't know.
That's
No,
fine.
he
It's a
was-
classical necessity for God, but what is God other than that?
Oh,
Necessary
I
material
defined God earlier. Here, let me go over the
Necessary
argument again
immaterial
since
mind.
Infinity's here. Just hold on. Infinity, the first premise is that space is not fundamental, justifying it using the fact that space doesn't account for information. This information has never been shown to be affected by space in between particles. This means that the universe is immersed in the classical sense of principalities and metaphysics. That's kind of a ABC as argument. The second premise is our minds can only be modeled in terms within non-physical reality. It's all that the states are collapsible or can't be reduced as purely physical models. And then the third premise is the same non-physical processes give rise to and supersede space-time and matter, according to the priors, clearly denoting that it's impossible for the universe to be self-sufficient in a physical sense. Then the first conclusion from that is hence it's necessary that this progenitor of physicality has a model of non-physicality will be indistinguishable from or identical to a mind. Then the fourth premise is minds are only non-spatial agent that we are aware of that can generate information. We know non-existence itself is also non-spatial, but it isn't an agent and neither does it generate information. And then the fifth premise is the seemingly necessary mind behind the coronation of the universe is what we would call God. Therefore, God exists. Therefore, there's no possible world in which God does not exist, given its necessary existence and the illogicality of the contrary position.
Yeah, so I don't see any reason to take the first premise to be true.
Oh, the justification for the
inside.
first premise is space itself cannot explain space itself. I already used this. The principles.
What do you think
that,
space is?
Space is just going to be the dimensional manifold that measures distance.
Okay. So it seems that seems to be information that's telling us about, the opportunities around us and the events.
Do you have
around
a
us, right?
problem with my definition of space?
I never said I did. But from your definition of space, if we were to take it to be consistent, this seemingly is explaining information. If it's explaining the distances, and we're using.
Yo, it's in the argument in chat.
It's in context to its progenation. So it's not just space having a definition, and that's it, like a smart cookie. No, it's more so that the reason for its existence can't be explained by space itself. And I said I would justify this using the fact that space can't affect information.
So what is the
there
reason
are
for its
multiple
existence?
studies showing that information is not
I'm fine with
affected by
this.
space
So what
between two
is,
particles.
like, the reason for space then?
I'm not fine with that, by the way. But wait, what was the argument? Where's the argument at? I just got done playing.
Yeah,
basketball.
can you send it in chat?
The first, yeah.
Gotcha, thank you.
Thank you, man.
And what's your
So
like,
nice.
obviously, what's your contention with it? Infinity.
Hold on, I need him to send the argument real quick.
Oh, yeah.
E1, space is not fundamental. Fundamental for what?
That's the first premise.
Fundamental for what?
I just told you in context to its progenation. So it can't ultimately explain why it exists.
Space can't explain why itself exists. Sure, that's completely fine.
Yeah. And if you like, I got a justification for this, but
Externally, at least.
I guess
Externally,
since you
yeah.
granted it already, you don't need me to explain
When you say I
further.
granted, I added the clarification. I don't know if you heard it.
You said it's fine.
So he clarified.
Yeah, I
afterwards,
agreed.
we
That
were
was an
talking.
agreement, but I added further clarification, is what I just said.
Yeah, I said space is not fundamental in context.
I know
of
what you
progenation.
said. I'm talking about whether or not you heard what I said, Clorox.
Okay, what did you say that is going to clarify anything about what
I
was
said I agree. However, that's talking about an external explanation, not an internal one.
No, I said space can't explain itself. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, I
that's
agree. That's
internal.
what you said. We're
Let's
talking
talk
about what
about
I
external
said correctly. But
No,
anyways,
space can't explain why space exists. That's an internal
I agree.
entity.
Wait,
We
look,
heard
it has
you.
self-motivation for its self-existence. It doesn't have external motivation for its self-existence. That's what I'm agreeing to. So if you're talking about internal justification or motivation, there's no argument for that. If you're talking about external motivation, obviously an entity cannot explain itself when it comes to its existence externally because it's internal. The entity is identical with itself. That's just trivially true. What the fuck? But
That's
move on to
why-
the
Okay.
that's why I'm a
Thank
bit
you for
confused, like, where
thank
we're
you
getting
for
from this.
agreeing me with
I'm
me.
sorry, what'd you say,
Okay,
Archie? You got cut off.
I said, yeah, and I don't know why I got cut off, but I said that's why I was saying earlier. Like, I'm a bit confused. Like, a lot of this seems trivial. It seems like you're grasping at something further beyond the obvious claims. Like, what are you trying to establish here by this?
No, these commonalities have certain denotations that are going to lead to a certain conclusion, and that's
Well,
why
everything
like
has a
the other
certain
premises.
denotation. That's gonna
So
lead
the
into
second
a
premise
certain
is our minds can only be modeled in terms within non-physical reality, as
Wait,
all
what's the
other
argument for
states
that?
are collapsible
What's
or
the
can be
argument for
reduced
that?
using purely physical models.
Wait, what's the argument for
The
that?
argument.
I just gave the argument for that.
Okay, and I'm assuming by non-physical, it lacks space, correct?
Yeah, it's non-spatial. Duh.
Okay, man. I don't know. You seem to be retarded, so you may be misdefining it or using
I
some
don't know. I
idiosyncratic
think you seem to
information.
be retarded because you're repeating everything I was saying. Just making
He
sure
never
you get what I'm
repeated
saying.
I ain't gonna lie,
What did
brother.
he
I didn't
repeat?
repeat anything that you said other than you repeating what I
You
said.
said,
but
"What's the argument for what I gave for premise one?"
you don't even know what
You
you're trying
didn't
to
even
say now.
just you just granted what I said. You said
Look,
it's going to
I'm
be
not even gonna
trivially
debate you.
true,
Just get the argument.
and I'm
real
like,
quick. We're not
okay,
even
it's
gonna
going to
have
be
that.
That's fine,
trivially
bro.
true. For
So where's the
That's
argument?
fine.
Wait, do you think
One at a
responding
time.
to me is supposed
So-
to be repetition? I'm sorry, what was that?
I already said it, like while you were talking.
No, I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to Steezy. I already know what you said. I know what you were talking
It
I'm
is
saying
what it
like,
is.
But what'd you say,
So
Steezy? I
if you're going to grant the first
That's-
premise,
oh
we're
my
going to move
God.
on to the second premise.
I can't.
Second
Look,
premise
we
is going to
grant
be
the first premise under the clarification we gave, but what'd you say, Steezy? I apologize for interrupting you. Go ahead.
I'm saying just go like one at a time, please.
All right.
Wow.
I guess.
all right. Sure.
Wow.
The second premise is going to be that our minds can only be modeled in terms of the non-physical reality.
What's the argument
All
for
other
that?
states are collapsible or can't be reduced using purely physical models.
What's the argument for
Okay,
that?
what's the argument for
What's
that?
the problem with physicalism?
That was going to be the justification for that.
What?
There
You are
exists.
listening. I'm sorry.
There
What was
exists
the
no
argument
other.
for
Wait
physicalism?
a minute. Wait a
I don't
minute.
mean to cut you off, but let me talk to Steezy real quick. When Steezy, I just got here,
This
so I don't
is
know if
this
there's
is
like an
this is
official.
really this is really
Let me
important.
finish
Oh
real
my
quick. So
gosh, but-
Steezy, let me talk to you real quick. When I just
Infinity.
got
This
here,
is really
I
important on
don't know.
Infinity.
So Steezy, can I please talk to Steezy real quick? Steezy, I don't know if there was like an official moderator we agreed to, but secondly, I just want to ask a quick question, a second question at that. What's the response to the following? What's the argument for that? And what's the problem for physicalism? What's the response? What's the
What's the
The second
justification?
premise is our
justification?
minds can only be modeled in terms with non-physical reality. The
We heard it.
justification is all other states are collapsible or can't be reduced using
Yeah,
purely
obviously,
physical
I'm
models.
asking for the argument for that. That's the claim. That goes circular.
That was the
Under
fucking
a
justification for
non-physicalist,
premise two.
let me
What's the
finish.
Are you
claim?
retarded?
Let me
That's the
finish.
claim.
Obviously, the argument for non-physicalism is going to be something along the lines of, and this is going to be the start. Obviously, everything is going to have some type of reduction to a non-physical, or not everything, but at least some facts within the word are going to have a non-physical reduction. That's obviously trivially true under the non-physicalist position. However, I'm asking for the argument for non-physicalism rather than us just using the alternative, which is physicalism. Retard. I said,
I'm
what's
not
the problem? with
presupposing the
physicalism? Let me
position of
finish.
non-physicalism.
Yes, you
Let me
are.
finish. Let me finish.
That's
I never
the
said that
justification. No, I
physicalism-
don't have to.
You're
Listen,
presupposing.
the
You're
non-physicalist
presupposing.
stance to
You're
You're
presuppose that.
presupposing a
Would you like to mute him?
non-physicalist framework.
Steezy, would you just like to mute him? Thank you. So just to be clear, the question was the following. At least this is one of the questions. What's the problem with physicalism? You in response said, what's the argument for physicalism? I never said physicalism was true. I don't see the lack of motivation which you obviously are proposing when it comes to physicalism. Now, Obviously, you are presupposing non-physicalism when it comes to P2 because you talk about the non-reductibility when it comes to physical facts about the world. You're saying that there's things in which cannot be reduced to physical facts. Obviously, a physicalist is going to want to say that almost everything, if not everything, if you're a hard physicalist, is going to be able to be reduced to physical facts. So I'm going to ask once again, what's the justification for non-physicalism? I never made a claim about physicalism or invoking physicalism.
Infinity, you're retarded to say that I have to take that position to presuppose that in the premise. I'm saying that that's the justification for it.
He just
Yeah,
repeated
obviously,
himself.
the
Oh my goodness.
justification,
Wait.
the justification presupposes something. But did you have something to say? Archie?
It doesn't
Before-
presuppose
Yeah,
a
I
physicalist
actually do have
position
something to say.
at all.
Yeah,
Like,
you-
I agree it doesn't
he's
presuppose
interrupted.
this is a
physicalist
shadow box to
position.
death.
So can you
Infinity.
I
mute him?
agree it doesn't.
I was
hold
trying
on,
to
Archie.
respond.
Hold on. I agree it doesn't presuppose the physicalist position. It presupposes the non-physicalist position. But what were you saying, Archie? Before you
It doesn't
blew into
presuppose
Thank
the
you.
non-physicalist
So what I was saying
position.
Yeah, what's
is,
the argument
yes,
for
it
that?
does, and
You're
I'm about
obviously
to explain why.
Go ahead, Archie.
Right? I mean, the idea is, right?
I'll explain why
So
it doesn't.
you're not entirely understanding. You're going to be muted if you try to interrupt me. So let's just be cordial, right? I mean, the idea is that you're getting at here. If you're trying to say that something cannot be reducible to some physical entity or some physical status, right? That means you're immediately ruling out physicalism. You have to rule out a physicalist framework and view in order to presuppose and hold to that conclusion. The reason why is because that commitment is not what physicalism holds to. Okay, so when you ask for justification behind, physicalism, right? You're saying that for whatever reason we have to give some account for something that you're ruling out, but you're presupposing that this is ruled out, and we just don't see a reason for why. So we're not making a claim about physicalism, right? And this is something that you do have to impose, because if you do not impose this, if this is something that you do not rule out, and you're saying that this could be ruled in, you're not saying this is certain that it's ruled out, then that means you're not actually holding to the claim that these things, can't be reduced to physical status, which would just it would just pose the question, why is it that it's immaterial? Why is it that you're getting that the mind is immaterial?
Additionally, I don't even grant that there exists a possible for the mind being non-physical, depending on the view of the mind. And then, for further clarification, if you're taking hard physicalism, you're going to have to affirm some type of universal law in which instantiates universal properties. A particular is going to defeat that universal law or instantiator. So if you say that there exists something in which is non-reducible to a physical fact, then that particular is going to defeat the universal claim that physicalism commits to, which is trivially true. But what's the response with the argument?
Both of these statements are retarded, and here's why. The following premise, which is premise 2, it follows from the first premise. That is the law that I'm imposing, that you granted, that automatically denotes this as the case.
Is that
So
it?
when I give the justification for premise 2 being that all other states within physicality, not just presupposing non-physicality as a position, is unjust, collapsible, or can't be reduced to physical models. You're grossing over the entailment of the premise 1 that you just agreed to, and now you're saying I need to impose some sort of universal law to substantiate this. But premise 1 already notes this as the case.
Not really.
Look, I don't
Even
know.
my justification for premise 1 denotes this as the case, saying that justifying is using the fact that space doesn't account for information. This information has never been shown to be affected by space between particles.
So we differentiate.
Look, wait,
and we
Archie,
discerned and
So
future-
the necessary wait a
Yo.
minute, I'm almost done. So the necessary denotation. Wait a minute, guys. Hold on. So the necessary denotation for that is that is just it's just going to be something that denotes this being the case. It's not going to be something that may not have to already presuppose the non-physicalist position of Irie. You know?
So we discerned an external and internal account.
So come again. Come again.
Look, Chloride.
I'm not even at the third
Please
premise
say-
for infinity.
That's completely fine, but move on, please. Look, in the future, can you please say done when you're done with your sentence or done with your point? Because you take long pauses because trying to send you the script to read. But look, me and Archie are going to respond to the simple points you made.
Brown hasn't sent me a physical
Archie, would
text,
you
by
like
the
to
way.
start first? I'm sorry, I don't think we were done.
Single
Can you please
text.
mute him, Steezy? I'm sorry, I don't think we were done. Can you
Here,
please
I'm
mute him,
here, I'm
Steezy?
muted.
I'm sorry, I don't think we were done. Anyways, so Archie, would you like to start on me?
I mean, for the most part, I don't really get what you're not understanding. I mean, not only did Infinity mention over 3 times that we specifically clarified and discerned an external critique from an internal critique, or explanation, right? So I'm not really sure why you're grasping at the idea that if we grant your first premise for whatever reason, we're already stating that these things can't be reduced. That's a bit silly. But, okay.
Mhm. Yeah, so look, there's 2 things. Well, there may be more than 2 things depending on how retarded you are, but to start to start with the simple things. 1, just because we grant P1 and then we disagree with the qualification of P2 does not mean we're retarded. We can disagree that P2 follows from P1. Obviously, that's one trivial fact out the way. I obviously can grant P1 under the clarification that I named as Archie commented when he retarded or when he gave your retarded ass fucking point away. I can get that you believe P2 is something that follows from P1. 100% sure. You can get that. What's the argument as to why P2 follows from P1, specifically under the clarification of our agreement? Now, if our agreement goes against, at least the clarification, if our clarification / agreement goes against your belief when it comes to P1, we can backtrack because you were too retarded to realize our clarification, although we repeated it 3 fucking times. And then, in response to the second point, brother,
You done, nephew?
We're not done.
Okay. Take your time. They're looking for something new to say, man.
We're not done. Please stop interrupting.
My fault.
Bro,
Your
please
Majesty.
mute. Please mute.
but anyways, let me just clarify. There's a difference between a why and a how. So there possibly exists a how for how space. I apologize. There possibly exists a how when it comes to an explanation for space existing. But does that mean that there exists a why? No. Does that mean that there needs to exist a why? No. So why something exists is distinct from how it exists. The how can be derived from what property instantiates the why. But does that mean they're identical? No. They can just be a causal relationship. Meaning that I can grant that, for example, something like space, and I'm not saying I do grant this is just a hypothetical. I can grant something like space existing without a why, but I can also grant space existing with a how. Meaning that we can say there is a
Nah,
reason
region
in terms
change,
of
Sota.
Mhm. We can say that there is an antecedent for the consequence of space, but not a
Nah,
why for the consequence of space, which is distinct. But look, Archie, do you have anything else to add or no?
Well, I don't know. I mean, someone moved my hearing alt, so I couldn't necessarily hear. But yeah, I do think it's pretty silly that you're trying to, I guess, equivocate the how and why. I mean, we can know things about functionality, and you can know facts about the world, but your conclusion just isn't implied from it. I mean, I don't even think you've properly related your first premise to your second premise. Nor do I even think you actually understand our agreement. But I mean, I guess I just want to ask you a question that you can start off when you start speaking again. What exactly do you think our clarification was?
You done now?
Yup. I don't know why I was moved down.
Okay, cool. I don't know why you was moved down either.
I didn't do that, by the way. I don't know who the
Tracking demons, by the way. I said that, and I'm glad you agreed to my first premise, Affinity, and you ignored and completely shadowboxed the justification as to why premise 1 would lead to premise 2, logically speaking. I can go over it again if you want. I said the space is not fundamental, meaning that justifying it using the fact that space doesn't account for information, as information has never been shown to be affected by space between particles, and it means that the universe is emerged in the classical process of principalities and or metaphysics. This would automatically lead to premise 2, saying that our minds can only be modeled in terms within non-physical reality, as all other states are collapsible or can't be reduced using purely physical models. That second part, all other states being collapsible or can't be reproduced or reduced using purely physical models, is referring to the justification for premise 1, saying that space doesn't account for information, as information has never been shown to be affected by space between particles, which means that the universe is emerged in some classical sense of principalities or metaphysics. Now, on to what Archie said about me not providing or falsely conflating the why and the how when it comes to the progenation of the universe. What I said was, in a logical sense of the how, the universe can't explain itself, but I know Infinity would automatically agree that the universe can't explain itself as to why it exists. And by why it exists, I'm not talking about in terms of an odd or any moral argument. I'm talking about specifically in how we can explain the universe's existence, so the existence of space itself. For space not being fundamental was his first premise, as a justification for why it wouldn't be able to explain minds, which would automatically lead into the second premise, saying that our minds can only be modeled in terms with a non-physical reality. So you kind of would have to grant me the first premise if you give me the first one or the second one. Fuck.
Wow.
Nice, fuck.
We would have to grant the first premise if we grant you the first premise. No, really.
Yeah,
Anyways,
I'm
are you done?
you have to
He's
grant me
done.
the second premise, so you got me the first one. My fault.
Anyways, look, so there's multiple retarded things that you
I'm
said.
training my
One,
nephews right now. Are you
He
gone?
also never answered the question.
Look, before we get to him dodging the question for the 5th time, are you done, Clorox, so we don't interrupt you?
Archie only asked me one time what their clarification was.
Wow. Okay, anyways, look, so in
And
response
you
to
answered
everything,
0 times.
Wait, hold on. He's gonna start rambling. Okay. One, we say space doesn't account for information. That's not what I agreed to. I agreed to P1 under my clarification. I specifically noted that if P1 under your belief, let me finish. If P1 accounting for your beliefs means something distinctly from my agreement, then that's something I don't grant. However, I agree to P1 with these conditions along the lines. And Archie, did you hear a response when it comes to disagreeing with the clarification I gave?
It's quite funny. I didn't.
Okay, so another thing is just because we may possibly, which I don't even grant, you have to justify that, just because we may possibly not be able to give a why as to why the universe exists, or when it comes to the universe giving a why explanation, doesn't mean we can't give a how explanation. So although we may not have epistemic access to the why, because God is a good explanation for things, if you're religious or something like that, sure, doesn't mean that we can't give an explanation, motivation, or justification for how. Additionally, even if it exists independent of our mind in the first place, that why and how, does that mean that there isn't a why and how? No, it is not. So you saying that, for example, space can interact or hasn't interacted
Can you
with
repeat that point
information thus
again?
far?
Just make sure.
Yes,
I
I can
hear you
repeat the
cut off
point.
again.
That's completely fine. But hold on. Look, Archie, did I cut off for you?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I'll repeat that then, Clorox. Look,
Good looks.
so when we talk about epistemic access relative to spatial interaction with information, one, I don't even grant that being justification. Look, it can be a motivator for you, but I don't grant that being valid justification for a positive conclusion. When you say we've never seen spatial, and this is the claim that he made verbatim, by the way, I have a voucher in VC, that mean Archie. Look, when you make the claim that spatial axes or space is not able to interact with information because thus far it hasn't been the case or it hasn't done so, I don't grant that. Look, it may be something in which is outside of our perception or conceivability. Obviously, we're only able to conceive of what we've seen or things we've experienced or things that we're putting parts to make a composite of within our minds. So I don't grant epistemic access being a motivation, a valid motivation slash justification for a positive conclusion relative to topics such as this. So you can say something along the lines of, intuitively, I don't grant the fact that space is able to interact with information due to my empirics. However, whether or not that's a valid form of justification due to how methods of interaction work and how it may extend past our perception slash conceivability, I'm not going to grant that that follows. So under this position, it is not the case that P2 follows under P1, because the clarification I'm granting is that you or me potentially may not be able to give an external reason as to why space exists, or space is not able to externally justify its own existence. But the reason why space is not able to externally justify its own existence is because it's identical with itself. So any motivation it gives is obviously going to be something which is internal. And then the motivation for its existence is going to be its existence. It's going to go circular. It's tautological. So the reason why space exists is going to be because it's able to have this definitional value. It's analytically true that space exists because it fits all criterias of existence under the analytical criteria that I have in mind. So that's going to be actual justification relative to its internality. Does that mean that it can't justify itself externally? No, but I'm saying I can grant it not being able to justify itself externally with a reason, of course. It's not because, well, God is the only reason that space exists. No, it's just the case that it's identical to itself. So any form of justification that's actually valid is going to be internal. That's just trivially true as well. But Archie, do you have anything to add before I say my last point?
I mean, just the fact that he still didn't answer, so I'll repeat again the question very clearly. What do you think our clarification was, especially upon infinity having to clarify for you again?
Okay, that's what I was also going to ask, so you can go. Niggers. Yep.
Okay. So Infinity, your
Yo.
argument is, no offense, kind of retarded. But you say, did you agree to P1 with these clarifications? These clarifications that you gave were exactly what I was denoting, besides what you were arguing when you said that it wouldn't follow from the first to second premise. The justification I gave for P1 is specifically referring to how it exists in terms of its ontology, not just what we haven't found and what explanatory power gives this thing to exist. No, I'm not saying that you're missing the point. The motivation isn't coming from what we haven't found about the subject when it comes to matter or space affecting information between two particles. It's about what we have found. We know it's demonstrably true that space does not affect information between two particles. We've known this ever since around 2008 or 2009. There's some studies on it, but you can demonstrate the falsity of the contrary position.
What the fuck?
Like we know for a fact that that's the case. And if this is specifically what I'm referencing, and which you've already granted to me that it is what I'm referencing in P1, that the premise would be that space is not fundamental. So not only in the how or in the why, but also in the sense that it can't fundamentally explain itself in terms of
Archie, you have your camera on
internally
again,
as
though.
well.
So
I
it's
don't know
low.
what's going on with his shit, but anyways, yeah, justification is going to be that using this fact for the space doesn't account for information. This information has never been shown, or also never does affect by space between two particles, and it means that the universe is immersed in the classical sense of principalities, which means that the derivative from this first premise goes directly again into the second premise. And if you want to move on from this point, if you feel like we're just going back and forth, we can. Which is our minds can only be modeled in terms of non-physical reality given the priors. And this should still not have been refuted, even though you tried to falsely conflate what my point was with what you would agree to. I told you what you already agreed to is going to denote why I was arguing in the first place. My fault. Me bomba.
Okay, so when I never said that was your point, I said that was the thing that I agreed to, meaning that although I agree with some parts of your point, I don't agree with the entire thing, which is what the clarification is for. Additionally, let me finish. I don't know why you're cutting me off.
My fault. My
Additionally, a
fault.
lack
I
of
thought it was you.
demonstration. I'm sorry, I don't think I was done. Anyways, additionally, a lack of demonstration is not going to be justification for a positive conclusion. You went circular on that in. You also said alongside the fact that we've never seen it or it hasn't been demonstrated, it is the case that it just hasn't happened. I don't grant at that at all. I'm going to need the argument for that. To further add on to that as well, we see that the representations, meaning the things in which space represents or represents space, I apologize, the things in which represent space are able to interact with temporal facts. In fact, every single thing interacts with information. So if it is the case, which by definition, this is true, I don't know if you have some idiosyncratic definition because that's what you low tiers do. By definition, if information is just a fact, then everything in which exists within space and experiences temporality interacts and changes and manipulates and codifies temporal facts. In other words, temporal information. Meaning that, for example, if it is the case, or in other words, if it is the fact of the world that Zindi is within one location and then I move him, that space interacting with space, therefore changing the fact. In other words, interacting with the information because it's implementing a new law of information or implementing the information which is there to a different destination or just changing it overall. So it's giving it either one, an additional feature, it's disqualifying a feature it possesses, or it's erasing the temporal fact overall. So space is actually by definition, at least the representations relative to space, which by the way, that's what space is defined by, its representations most likely, then by definition, it is the case that spatial axes and space itself are able to interact with information. Now, in response to the other points, look, I don't care about a
Can you
lack of
repeat
a
that one more
reason.
time? I
Let
was
me
on the side.
finish. Okay, that's completely fine. You
My
don't
fault.
have to listen. But I'll repeat it at the end if Archie wants me to, or if I feel charitable. But let me finish the point, please. Anyways, so a lack of justification. I'm going to keep on repeating this because you have yet to respond to this. Maybe you're going to respond to it in your next Ramble Fest. A lack of justification is not rooms for a positive conclusion relative to this fucking topic. So when you say something along the lines of, well, you can't demonstrate how it's false, does that make it true? No, it doesn't. You can't demonstrate how it's true. Let me clarify this, brother. Space exists because there's a feature of the world, or I apologize, of reality in which instantiates its existence. Now, you're naming God. I'm saying I don't grant God's existence because it seems to be one inconsistent. Additionally, it seems to be something in which has unwarranted assumptions that I don't grant or commit to. And then thirdly, I have a reason in mind when it comes to my faith that does not ascribe to specifically your faith or whatever God you're talking about, which you clarified at the start, namely. So everything exists because there's some feature of reality in which it substantiates its existence. It's metaphysically impossible for things to exist if it is the case that there's not a feature of the world or reality in which instantiates its existence. That's also trivially true. Every point that I'm naming is trivially true. Why? Because I'm speaking common sense. Your argument is defeated by common sense. Now, Archie, do you have a response? And then also notice how he didn't respond to the question Archie asked 3 times.
That's literally all I have to say. He just hasn't answered the question.
You done?
Yes, I am, sir.
All right. Cool beans. Okay. So Infinity, you made 3 huge shadow boxes, and I want to list them out to you. So I want you to know that my argument wasn't circular, your shadow box. I also clarified that merely not observing a phenomena or having it be the case doesn't mean it doesn't happen. My argument was that it was demonstrably false, like the contrary position. That's what my my third conclusion was saying, given the illogicality of the contrary position, and the priors automatically necessitate it. You're not attacking this, so I don't know how to respond to this without repeating myself. We can conclude on this if you want, and I can move on, or we can just end the entire discussion if you want to, if Archie's down with that too. And I said that the lack of justification also isn't my argument, it's another shadow box you did, because it's demonstrably false. If you refer back to my first two premises, I said that space is not fundamental. Wait a minute. I said the space is not fundamental. And I gave prior to this saying that the fact that space doesn't account for information has never been affected by space and between particles, and it means the universe is emergent in a classical sense of principalities or metaphysics. Now this means when at least when you asked me earlier, I did clarify that this is specifically referring to studies that have demonstrated the falsehood of the notion that you're holding when you assume the contrary position. And given the illogicality of the contrary position, that would be a proof by impossibility toward my position being true. It wouldn't be that you just don't have to grant anything to me. These aren't unwarranted assumptions, Infinity. You have to understand what my argument is and actually attack it. Also, for Archie, I did answer his question unironically.
What was the question?
In the last say it again.
Can you tell me what Archie's question was and then answer it real quick?
Yeah, Archie's question. Chill. Archie's question was, did I know what his clarification was?
No,
that's not the question.
Is that not the fucking question?
Wrong.
I just said
so
it
I
wasn't.
asked you, what was the clarification?
But that's what I just fucking said.
No,
what
you.
the fuck?
That's not
No,
what
no,
you
no.
said.
That's not what you said.
You're retarded.
Wait,
You know
do
this is
think
on rec,
asking-
right?
Do you think asking?
oh, Clorox, you're so
Wait,
wrong.
here.
You
Look,
actually
brother,
said, Archie
calm
said,
down,
what
calm
was his
Do you need a
justification?
moderator?
Or what was his
Or
clarification?
do you need a
Sorry, but I also
moderator, or
wasn't
can you
really
behave?
saying, But yes, Steezy, can you please mute him? I don't think
Can
we're
you
done.
track?
Wow.
Well, could you?
Anyways, so look, Archie, do you want to point out the blender in me?
I mean, so listen, I'm not asking whether you're verified in knowing this knowledge. So I'm not asking you if you do know or whether you can verify that you know, in the sense to where I need to know whether you know or don't know. That's a pretty simple question. Whether me asking whether you know and then me asking you to explain what you think I'm asking you whether you know or not, those are two different questions. So one question you can simply answer with a yes, right? But clearly a yes wouldn't be sufficient to me asking what the clarification was, because the clarification wasn't yes, right? So seemingly
Okay.
that's just a retarded blunder you made, which is on recording, which you laughed at yourself by, right? But go ahead and finish.
Yeah. So basically, in sum, what he said was, the question of do you know what the clarification is different from what is the clarification. Obviously, everybody would grant that. Even Zenny knows this. W Zenny, tier 3. Look, one, don't grant any priors. You saying that there exist priors doesn't mean that there exist priors. Secondly, just because we have no method to actually analyze whether or not there is information gathering or manipulation when it comes to space doesn't mean that there is no method that exists, brother. We may not be able to conceive of it or perceive it yet. Another thing is, you saying it's illogical. Look, I'm going to say one, no logicality is demonstrated other than the presupposition that your studies are true, which talks about the lack of my conclusion. And then obviously that would infer illogicality if my conclusion was true, although the studies demonstrate the lack of my conclusion successfully. Well, wow, there exists people giving their opinions. I agree that people can provide misinformation and then have incorrect studies due to epistemic limitations or method limitations or retarded beliefs. There's multiple studies, like for example, there's studies of God not existing, there's studies of God existing, there's studies of moralities that I don't grant, there's studies of the philosophy of aesthetic that I don't grant because I have the best aesthetic, etc. I don't give a fuck, my nigga. Like, damn, what's the response? Okay, you saying that there exist studies in which have demonstrated the falsehood doesn't mean that there actually are accurate studies that demonstrated the falsehood. I don't have to understand your points to defeat it. By the way, that's another retarded blunder you made. I can defeat points without understanding it. For example, if it is the case that you get P1, which is that God exists, for example, I can say that. What the fuck? Justify that arguments exist. I may not understand what you mean by God. I may not understand what you mean by P1 at all. But if I question whether or not, or even defeat arguments existing, the claim that arguments exist, that will be an indirect contention to your point, which is that P1 God exists. So I don't need to understand your fucking arguments to defeat them. That's another retarded blunder you made, okay? So you say you didn't go circular, doesn't mean you didn't go circular. Two, you blundered on the question and you blundered on that last point. Let's conclude, please.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. We can conclude after this. Holy shit, Shadowbox of the century. Okay,
Bro,
so
you have the same
the
historical
thing is,
text.
wait a minute. Wait till me in infinity, I boy them, bati boy them. Let me explain the premise. Okay, so the reason why I said that that's exactly what I said was because earlier in the justification for the first premise, I specifically answered what Archie's clarification was, not if I knew it or not. That's why I said when the question was whether I knew it or not, I demonstrated that by saying what it was in the justification for the first premises portion. So that was not a blunder. That was just another horrible shadow box on your part. You keep punching yourself in the face argumentatively. Don't worry, we'll amp you later. And also, you made another blunder yourself, saying that you can't conceive of it and also it being the case at the same time, or doesn't necessarily mean it's not the case at the same time. If this is a horrible blunder, obviously, because if you can't conceive of something, then it is logically impossible. And that was a part of my proof by impossibility argument earlier, showing that you not only didn't track, but I didn't go circular, and you were the one claiming the same things over and over again. About your studies point, the studies actually show that the falsehood is demonstrated. Not say that these studies are invalid, but then we would have to go into the validity of the studies, which we hadn't gone into because I didn't feel the need to bring it up as evidence, since the proof by impossibility argument earlier wasn't even addressed by you because you're such a tracking demon, Infinity. So yeah, we can conclude after this. But let me just lay out my argument one more time, just to make sure everybody's clear and there's no tracking issues. So I define God as a necessary immaterial mind that is responsible for the progenation of the universe. Then the first premise was space is not fundamental, is one they had a problem with. And I justified it using the fact that space doesn't account for information, as information is never shown to be affected by space between particles. In the classical sense, would be the denotation of the universe's explanation. That's specifically referring to how and its ontology, not why it exists, X, Y, Z. And then the second premise is our minds can only be modeled within terms of non-physical reality. Fucking duh, this is going to follow from the first premise. And all other states responsibly by the possibility are collapsible or can be reduced using purely physical models. Third premise is the same non-physical processes give rise and supersede space-time and matter according to the price. Shut the fuck up, Infinity. I'm almost
Why are
done.
you giving the third premise?
Clearly denoting that it is impossible for the universe to be self-sufficient in a physical sense. The first conclusion, the sense is necessary that the progenitor of the physicality is a model of non-physicality which be indistinguishable from or identical to a mind. And the fourth premise is minds are the only non-spatial agent that we are aware of that can generate information. We don't know existence itself is also non-spatial, but it is an agent and neither does it generate information. And the fifth premise is the seemingly necessary mind behind the coronation of the universe is what we would call God. Therefore, God exists. There is no possible world in God exists given its necessary existence and the illogicality of the contrary position.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done. I feel
One,
like
you went circular. Secondly, I don't grant the conceivability thesis. Additionally, let me clarify what I mean. I don't grant that conceivability is something that which codifies logical impossibilities, meaning I don't believe that conceivability thesis governs the logical modal scope. Additionally, when I talked about conceivability, what I said was we may not be able to have conceive of the method yet, or we may have not conceived of the method yet because we lack the information which guarantees the conception of parts. So what I said was, and maybe you weren't listening, like you didn't listen to any of the other fucking arguments or questions, which you've yet to answer the question that Archie gave for the 10th time, by the way. But what I said was conceivability, in other words, what we're able to conceive of is based upon our information and our creativity, okay? So if we're not able to perceive or we don't have any information of the parts, we're not able to conceive of the composite. For example, we are able to conceive of a unicorn because we have read fictional stories in which talks about a horse leg, a horse back, a horse butt, a horse ass, a horse dick, and then other things that talks about, for example, a bird or an eagle. They have wings, and then we have things in which have horns, such as walruses. So we're able to take all of those individual parts and create a composite, which we label as analytically a unicorn. So we're able to conceive of a unicorn because of our prior information, our priors being that. So does that
Yo, who
mean that
kicked
I'm
me?
granting the conceivability? Let me finish. Does that mean
My
that I'm
fault.
granting the conceivability thesis?
Next
No,
game.
that's not what that means. I just don't grant the conceivability thesis. Our conceivability thesis, or our conceivability is based upon our prior information alongside our creativity. So we may not been able to, or we may have not perceived or gathered information relative to the method that's used for space to codify information or account for information. You keep on saying that these studies, we have to go over the studies of the validity of the studies. One, we don't even need to do that. Secondly, if you want to do that, we can, but you already said that you believe I failed to track something, which justifies your point either way, which, by the way, I'm not even going to point out how you're retarded for saying that because it's in the recording, but that kind of was your point, which justifies the illogicality. Anyways, I'm going to whisper that because you're not tracking anything else. But look, Archie, before I finish up real quick, do you have a response to anything else or no?
Just that I find it interesting that in the attempt to mask the fact that he actually didn't know the clarification, instead of answering, he shifted it from whether he knew to when he gave the clarification. So if I had asked him when he gave the clarification, his answer would have been perfect. But unfortunately, I did not ask him when he gave his clarification. I asked him what the clarification was, which is what made his answer wrong. But that's all I had to clarify for Rec, though.
Okay. So look, in some man, and please let's conclude after this. Please, please, please. What I said we may not be able to conceive of yet and or perceive of yet was talking about the method. And obviously that's based upon what I said, which was how conceivability is limited to these two things, that being creativity and knowledge. And then let me add an additional thing real quick for clarification so you don't call out for a blunder or some shit that doesn't exist. It's also limited to cognitive ability. So there's three things that exist in total. Conceivability, in other words, imagination, is limited to cognitive abilities, knowledge, and creativity. Boom. Can we conclude, please?
Yo. Okay. Yo,
Can we
Infinity.
conclude? Yo.
We can end it, but I'm just gonna let you know that
Before you let me know, are we concluding right
no,
now?
I did. Wait. Chill.
I don't mean to cut you off on my dead ass asking. Like, are we?
Yeah.
Is this it? Like,
I
are we
ain't
done
gonna
right
lie.
now?
Like, even Archie, from what he did, was kind of way more rhetorical what you were doing. But
that's
yo,
completely
Archie,
fine. Like, are we done?
I didn't
just
shift.
I just want to play.
I
I just want
didn't
to
show the
debate on
position of what.
Discord. Let me debate on
Chill.
Discord and Roblox.
I didn't shift on what was saying. I when you asked me what your clarification was, I was demonstrating. If I'm gonna replay Infinity's part just so y'all hear it again. He said space accentuates its existence after you agree with the first premise that makes it prove impossibility of the contradiction is being possible. So he already agreed to the first premise, which necessitates that what you just said, that space is feature that substantiates or has a feature that insinuates its own existence. It's just so like he wasn't. I'm gonna be fair to him and say he wasn't trying, rather than just like being a retard and arguing against like what I said, agreeing with it. You see, he says it has unwarranted assumptions. He said it doesn't grant God's existence. That's what's in question, by the way. I wouldn't expect to grant God's existence when God's existence topic is taking the opposite stance. It's completely fucking retarded. But yeah, he's besides the jargon, he's basically saying that there's no reason to believe that this is the case. And I'm demonstrating him evidence as to why it is the case in a logical proof, a proof by impossibility, and evidence that I suggest that we take a look at, which was the demonstrably false contraposition by scientists who, ever since 2008 to 2009, have done studies and research that shows that information isn't affected by physical space. And that was just him, like, obviously shadowboxing on that part because he didn't address that. And he didn't even want to go over the studies. He tried to invalidate the studies, saying that, the studies, I don't care if the studies do this or studies do that. It's not going to necessarily entail this conclusion. I also addressed that point with a fucking reductio of depth, and he never addressed that either. He played more of this.
Oh yeah, Clorox. Stop it a bit. Stop.
He also said, say it again.
I wanted to say that Awaken got banned, by the way. You were asking about Awaken earlier.
I'll unban him later.
Why did Awaken? Yeah, I'm banning Awaken.
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
I'm supposed to be running it with him or something.
Zany banned him, I think.
Yeah, because he called Muhammad a pedo.
Yo, based Awaken. Anyways, then he was saying.
But yo, Steve,
if you tapped in, you can already see like how he's failing to track my argument. I'll send the argument to you in
Yeah.
DMs so you can even read it and go over the rec again and say address this or attack this position specifically. Then he says the fact that the universe has a property that's a claim, by the way. He never substantiated this, but the universe has a feature or property that its existence in terms of how, even though he agreed with the first premise, and you can see that wasn't the case because the logical conclusion from the premise is going to be that just claim that the universe having a feature that's essentially its own existence is a valid point to make or a valid assertion. Like that would just be impossible. He also never attacked that either. Then he calls it common sense. I never seen a nigga concede and then call it common sense. See, I corrected him on this too because he made the argument that just because these things are never demonstrated to happen, which was in my premises, admittedly, but I did clarify what I meant by these things before he repeated himself again, saying that there is evidence that that refutes the contrary position, like literally, and he just says that he doesn't care. It doesn't automatically mean this, that, or the third. But what he's ignoring is that it actually does automatically mean this, that, and the third because it's the logical deduction. The inferential step is like securing the conclusion. But he didn't attack the third conclusion either, which was after the second conclusion, which was that God exists, and therefore, given these priors, he would have to exist in every possible world, given the illogicality of the contrary position. He didn't understand, or maybe he didn't even realize at the time, that every premise had a fucking reductio. That's how I knew he wasn't tracking it all. No, Steezy, I just freestyled this in the morning, and I was arguing while I was high out of my mind. Like, I told him that every justification for every premise had a reductio, and I can read over them if you want me to.
You could.
Yeah, let me pull them up again.
While you're doing that, hold on, my mom's calling me.
All right, bet. The first premise was space is not fundamental. Justification was using the fact that space doesn't account for information. There was evidence to demonstrate the falsity of this, which is the reductio. That information isn't affected by space, which would automatically mean that the universe is emergent in terms of principalities or metaphysics, not in terms of properties that it has that substantiates its own existence, which is what Infinity was trying to say it could be after agreeing this premise. Like I can retard, I did that. The second premise was our minds can only be modeled in terms of non-physical realities. Other states are collapsible or can't be reduced to purely physical models. That was another fucking reductio you didn't see. Then the third premise was the same non-physical processes give rise to and supersede space, time, and matter according to the priors, clearly denoting that it's possible, again, another reductio for the universe to be self-sufficient in the physical sense. And then the first conclusion was it's necessary that the progenitor of physicality has to have some non-physical properties that would be identical to or indistinguishable from my mind. And then the fourth premise was the minds are the only non-spatial agent that we are aware of that can generate information. And then I went into why non-existence wouldn't fall into this category, which is something that probably could have been brought up, but wasn't because we didn't even get to the fourth premise. The fifth premise was the seemingly unnecessary mind behind the coordination of the universe is what we would call God. Therefore, God exists. Then the third conclusion was therefore there's no possible world in which God does not exist, given its necessary existence and the illogicality of the contrary position. So instead of attacking all that, they attacked what they thought the argument was, which was a complete swing and miss, a complete shadow box. And I'm high off my rockers. I don't want to hear niggas say shit ever again. These niggas, bro, like they my Discord brethren, you know, cordial with them, but I'm always gonna let them know when they're being complete retards. It is what it is.
Damn.
What's to the next? And that's really all I gotta say. There's nothing else I really need to say. Everything else is in the recording, like all the other bullshit arguments that were getting refuted left and right.
All right, bet.